See you, Michael.
Good to be here, Gary.
This, I believe, calls into question Darwinian's theory of evolution. Is that correct?
Yes, Gary. Essentially, that theory says that human beings like us have been around for about 100,000 years. And before that, you would have had only ape-man-like creatures. Before that, apes and monkeys. What we found, however, when we looked into the entire history of archaeology, my co-author and I did 8 years of research. We looked at every archaeological discovery that's ever been made, and what we found is that there are hundreds of such discoveries that indicate human beings like ourselves have been around for literally millions of years. We had to do 8 years of research, translate papers from German, Russian.
You referred to in India the Vedic literature?
Well, yes.
What is that?
I was saying in the beginning that we do take our inspiration from these ancient Sanskrit writings of India. They're collectively called the Vedas. Among them are the Puranas. Purana is a Sanskrit word. It means history. Now, these histories tell of human civilizations on this planet going back millions of years.
How do we know those are accurate?
Well, that was our question too. Richard Thompson and I, we thought, well, if there's any accuracy to those statements, there must be some factual evidence to back them up. Now, when we looked in the current textbooks, of course, we didn't find any such evidence, but we thought, well, let's look a little bit further. And as I said, that led to an 8-year research program where we investigated every archaeological discovery ever made. And what we found is that, practically speaking, archaeologists and anthropologists have buried almost as much evidence as they've dug up. In other words...
Or perhaps overlooked, cast aside?
Well, yes, cast aside. And there have been some outright cases of suppression where people who have reported such things have had their careers ruined.
We should never, I don't think, be afraid to investigate opposing points of view.
This human person who looked like us, existed millions of years ago, did not evolve from an ape, as we are led to believe in the Darwin theory. Why has this evidence been suppressed, and what kind of evidence have you found to support this?
Well, I'll give you a very good example. Now, one example from historical times is during the California Gold Rush days, miners were digging tunnels thousands of feet into the sides of mountains. Now, the rock in these mountains is over 10 million years old. So when they were digging these tunnels, they were finding human skeletons, they were finding stone spear points, they were finding mortars and pestles, hundreds of them at dozens of locations. Now, all these were gathered together, reported to the scientific world by J.D. Whitney, who was the state geologist of California. And he published a massive book about them by Harvard University. Harvard University was the publisher. Now, what happened to these artifacts? Why aren't they on display in museums? Why aren't our children taught about them in schools? There was a very powerful anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution named William H. Holmes. And he said to Whitney, "You, Dr. Whitney, if you had understood the theory of human evolution as we understand it today, you would have hesitated to announce your conclusion, namely that human beings existed millions of years ago, despite the imposing array of facts with which you were confronted." In other words, simply because the facts didn't fit the theory, the facts had to go, and so did Professor Whitney.
But back then I would imagine that they did not have the scientific procedures to identify the exact age of bones and matter that we have today. So can you be confident that this researcher was able to give a time for these bones that were found?
Yes, we checked with the modern geologists about the age of the deposits. Now, these things continue to be discovered today, for example. And a vast amount of evidence showing that human beings like ourselves have been around for millions of years has been systematically suppressed. And I can give you some examples. For example, in 1979, Mary Leakey, who's one of the most famous archaeologists of this century, discovered in Africa completely modern human footprints, no different from the footprints that you or I would make on a beach today. Now, the thing about these footprints is they were found in rock that was dated 3.6 million years old. And that throws out completely any idea of human origins that's current today.
Why would anyone want information like that suppressed? What possible advantage would there be in that?
Well, power, prestige, money, there's a lot riding on it. If even one of the hundreds of cases that we document were found to be true, accepted, that would mean that everything we've been told about human origins and antiquity for the past 150 years is simply not true. And I don't think that the current establishment is ready to admit that.
I think that scientists find it harder in some ways than many other people, you see, and some other people, because there's still a strong commitment, even perhaps partly unconscious, to the old atomistic worldview.
So what you're saying is that science has shown us something that scientists do not want to see.
Well, they have become so used to the way of seeing it that they don't want to change it. You see, they feel uncomfortable about changing it, and they feel there's no reason to change it. Many of them, they say, well, we're doing so well now, why should we change it? In one sense, it looks as if we're doing very well, you see, but if you look at the broader view, it looks very dangerous.
In the 40s, there was a scientific magazine called The Geologist, and it reported that in Macoupin County, Illinois, which is right here in North America, in the United States, a human skeleton, just like ours, had been uncovered in a coal mine, in solid coal 90 feet deep underneath the ground. Now, Richard Thompson and I were able to discover from the reports exactly where that occurred. And we talked to the Geological Survey of the state of Illinois, and we asked them, well, how old is the coal there? And it turned out it was 300 million years old, which means it's older than the Jurassic, that word that everybody knows now, that refers to the dinosaurs. In other words, it was older than the age of the dinosaurs.
Wow. Okay, so that throws a whole new spin on it.
Yes, indeed it does. And some of the scientists who have read the book have obviously recognized that. For example, William Howells, who is one of the big anthropologists of this century, one of the architects of the current paradigm, he said, well, if what you say here is true, it more or less throws a monkey wrench into our whole picture of how life originated on this planet. And I think it does.
Something you alluded to a few moments ago I want to bring up again. You talked about man coexisting with apes and coexisting with another kind of ape-man creature, and you again mentioned North America, and I think, of course, there's always been a lot of interest in Bigfoot, which is essentially where this is coming from. Some of the information that you brought forward is that this is just a descendant of this same wild man creature that was existing years ago.
That's a distinct possibility. Now, when I first heard about this subject, I was extremely skeptical, but what turned me around is when I began to read reports about these creatures by very well-respected anthropologists. For example, Grover S. Krantz, who's at the University of Washington, up in the Northwest. He has extensively studied the footprints of these creatures, and he says they're biologically convincing. There is no possible way that they could have been hoaxed, and he's pretty well convinced that these creatures do exist. So that's the sort of thing that convinced me that there is a very good chance that they're there, and from the descriptions of these creatures, they seem to match very well some of the descriptions that we get of the ape-man-like creatures that supposedly existed millions of years ago.
Okay, so, but yet we keep coming around to the same thing. People just don't want to believe it. They just, like you said, well, they're skeptical. They go, oh no, that's just a hoax. They're not hearing the information that noted scientists are finding.
Well, all we really wanted to do in our book is put the facts on the table, all of them, not just the facts that you will see in the current textbooks, but all of the facts that are relevant to this whole subject, and let people draw their own conclusions.
One of the questions I first came up with when I was reading the book that you did answer in the book that I'd like you to explain was that I said, well, gee, don't we have all these machines now that can look at the footprints or the bones or whatever, and that will just tell us how old it is?
Oh, this is a very common perception. We have such faith in technology and those who employ it that when we hear about things like carbon-14 testing or potassium-argon testing, we think it really is a very simple process, almost like you pop something in the microwave and boom, it comes out. It's not like that at all. These are very complicated procedures. What I found in practice is that scientists may run several tests on the same piece of bone. Some of the ages will be very great, some very small, and they will tend to pick the date to publish in their scientific literature that most fits the idea that they start out with about how old the fossil should be. Now that often happens.
What do scientists and researchers have to gain by distorting their findings? I mean, you would think that if they truly think that they found evidence of man pre-existing the dates that we take for granted right now, that they would want to be published, that they would want people to hear about this, that they would get their name up in lights, as it were, as making this remarkable discovery. Why is this so suppressed?
Well, there are tremendous pressures for conformity within the scientific community. For example, for every academic post that opens up, every professorship that opens up in an American university, there are generally hundreds of applicants. And it does not help your reputation if you go reporting things that should not be reported. It could be very bad for one's reputation. And in our book, we document several cases of that. For example, Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's a geologist who I personally know. She lives in Colorado now. She went to Mexico in the 1970s, and she was a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. She dated a site there where some human artifacts have been found at 300,000 years. All her test results show that that was the age of that site. But because that went against the dominant idea that human beings have only been in North America for 30,000 years, she said she was not able to get the report published. She was labeled a publicity seeker and a maverick in her community of scholars, and she said she eventually lost a professorship that she held at an American university because of this, and hasn't been able to work as a geologist since. Now, this is not the normal picture that we have of how science works, but unfortunately, these are the sorts of things that can happen, and these are the sorts of pressures that can be applied in order to keep a certain view intact.
So what do people need to do now? They apparently, we need the public to open their minds up a little bit more to alternative ideas to what we've been taught.
Well, I think one thing we need to do is develop a little bit more of a healthy skepticism towards pronouncements from spokespersons from the scientific community. Just as we've learned not to accept without question every pronouncement that may come from the press secretary of a politician or the public relations office of a corporation. We may want to dig a little further, keep an open mind, have some healthy skepticism, and I think perhaps we've placed spokespersons from the scientific community on a little bit of a pedestal, and we may need to give them the same sort of treatment that we would give to spokespersons from other groups in society.
Let's just put the facts on the table and look at them and see how they've been dealt with. It shouldn't matter, what your motive is. It's like bowling. If you bowl a strike, who cares if you're doing it for this reason or another. I mean, facts are facts. Now, the facts that we've uncovered...
Well, we know statistics
Right.
can be distorted for whichever way someone wants them to be distorted. We know that.
Right.
You and I could take the same statistic and change it around and make it look different.
So let's look at them.
You have talked in terms of the fact that scientists don't cheat. That's a myth. You say there's actual cheating going on.
Oh, that's very well documented. For example, the Piltdown case is a very famous case that documents that. Now, what that has to do with is early in this century, there was a purported discovery of an ape man in England based on a skull and a jawbone. And this Piltdown ape man, was in the science textbooks for about 40 years. And then suddenly it was revealed that the British Museum had tested these fossils and determined that it was a very elaborate hoax. And many people have speculated about the identity of the person who was the hoaxer, and practically all of them center on different scientists in England, such as Sir Grafton Elliot Smith or Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, all very well-established scientists in England, because only somebody who knew the scientific method very well could have prepared these fossils in such a way that they would have fooled the scientific community all around the world for 40 or 50 years. So some scientist who wanted to perhaps give some evidence in favor of evolution, because there's not very much of it, invented this ape man, and in a very sophisticated way cheated, literally. And this is admitted by the scientists themselves. And there are more examples I could give.
Evidence that goes against human evolution is reported only by crackpots.
Now this is one of the standard techniques that the scientific community tries to use against anybody that reports something that goes against their ideas. They try to label them in a derogatory way without actually discussing the facts. And I think we've all had experience of that. But the real facts is that actual scientists have, over the past 150 years, reported many astounding facts that go against the theory of evolution. And the present scientific community doesn't want people to know that. They want to promote the idea that anybody that's against evolution is somehow or other a religious fanatic, a crackpot, but it's simply not true. And I've personally met scientists who have discovered some of these things, and what happens to them is it's very unfair, the treatment to which they are subjected.
We're going to go to Anton in Brookfield, Wisconsin. Anton, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Your comment.
I've often wondered how the perfect complementary male-female systems of reproduction could have evolved from unintelligent life forms.
You know, Anton, not only is that a good question, but also the point is if evolution occurred, it'd have to be simultaneous evolution of both species at the same time.
Right.
Because if it took 1 million years for the female to evolve, it would have kind of messed up the whole procreation thing, wouldn't it?
Right. That's my question.
A good question. Stay right there. Michael Cremo, your response.
Well, I would like to put together a book called Darwin's Fairy Tales. And I think that would be one of them. You can just look at so many examples of complex structures and behaviors in different creatures, whether it's how the spider learned to spin its web, or how our human reproduction system came about, or any of these things. They're a complete mystery. They're not explained even theoretically by the evolutionist, and what they do is, when they want to explain anything, they just wave their magic wand and say, it happened by evolution. And that's why I call it Darwin's fairy tales.
If you were to predict what archaeologists might find, you would say, well, they would tend to find a very bewildering mixture of anatomically modern human fossils, ape-man-like fossils, crude stone tools, articles indicative of a higher level of culture, all sort of mixed up and going back, hundreds of millions of years. Mm-hmm. I think you might also predict that given the biases of investigators towards a linear progressive idea of time, with things beginning in a very simple state and progressing in a linear fashion to a more advanced state, that they might edit that record to conform to their linear progressive biases. And indeed, both predictions we found in our investigations do come true. You actually do have that very bewildering, mixture of advanced artifacts and bones mixed up with more primitive ones, going back hundreds of millions of years. And you also do find a very systematic editing of this record to conform to a linear, progressive, you might call it evolutionary view of things, which is quite amazing.
Of course, if we have this sort of cyclical picture, circular picture of things, much of conventional science will need to be readjusted.
There's still a strong commitment, even perhaps partly unconscious, to the old atomistic worldview.
So what you're saying is that science has shown us something that scientists do not want to see.
Well, they have become so used to the way of seeing it that they don't want to change it. You see, they feel uncomfortable about changing it, and they feel there's no reason to change it. Many of them, they say, well, we're doing so well now, why should we change it? In one sense, it looks as if we're doing very well, you see, but if you look at the broader view, it looks very dangerous.
Now, many people are talking about this new worldview that's coming up these years. Do you see a new worldview coming up in the Western world?
Well, in a certain part of the Western world, yes. I think a worldview in which there's more focus on wholeness, on process, rather than on analysis into parts and more static constituents.
But does that come up because we want it, or because we are forced to take on it?
Well, probably both. I mean, that is, I think a certain fraction of the people want it. Perhaps they're tired of the old one, they don't feel it's working. And also there's some evidence for it, I think, especially in physics, and probably in other sciences as well. The evidence in physics comes partly from relativity and partly from quantum theory. Or perhaps more from quantum theory than relativity. Again, all of these you see combined to the notion that the universe is a kind of indivisible whole, rather than analyzed into constituent elements which interact as separately existent. So the classical level, Newtonian level, is explained by quantum mechanics as a limiting case, you see, of a more, so that you have a whole, but the whole determines itself to behave somewhat like independent parts in many cases. So even whether it's going to be behaving like parts is determined by the whole, right?
But what we can see is the parts rather than the whole.
We see, in physics, we see the parts because that's the way we approached them the last few centuries. I don't know if, you see, I think our perception is influenced by our way of thinking, so that we accept this mechanical way of looking at things. But if you went back 1,000 or 2,000 years, I don't think people actually saw the parts as primary. The way we see it depends on the way we think, you see. We actually make up everything in the sense all these theories are made up by us, but in these theories we place the parts, we may either place the parts as fundamental or the whole as fundamental. Now, the quantum mechanics is placing the whole as fundamental. That's, I think, the most basic change it makes, right? Finally, every theory is made up by us, and we're going to see whether we can apply it coherently to reality. You see that I think we could make an infinity of different kinds of theories, and some of them would be more coherent than others, you see. For example, if somebody is said to be mentally disturbed, he has another theory which we think is incoherent, but to him it looks coherent, right? Because we can always ignore what is not working, you see. Or we say we'll solve that later.
You just said that in reality we make it all up, not just the parts, but also the wholes. Could you explain?
Well, I think that's the question. What is the relationship of theory to reality, you see? Now, one view is that it reflects reality, you see. Now, I think that it corresponds to reality. I think that view is only limited, right? Like a map is said to correspond to a city, but there's nothing on the map that corresponds to anything in the city. In the map you see dots of print, and the city, which is very vaguely defined, the city is also vaguely defined. So what corresponds is certain abstractions that we abstract. Right? But the map, the real test of the map is that it guides us correctly in the city. And if it's a wrong map, we will find incoherence, right, in our action, right? Now, you see, so therefore we make it all up, but the question is how coherent is it when we try to make it work? You see, that's really the key. Some theories are more coherent than others, but it's often hard to tell because when we come to a theory as broad as a worldview, we find it very hard to detect incoherence because the worldview tends to state that things that don't fit are irrelevant, or else says we're going to get them in order later. We haven't solved that problem yet. So incoherence can easily be not noticed, right? But if people are and also people would like not to have their worldviews questioned, because they have got used to them and feel comfortable with them. So therefore, it's very hard to question a worldview.
But in effect, that's what you are doing.
Yeah.
And in effect, you are questioning the whole Western worldview.
Yes. Well, yes. I think even all the worldviews need to be questioned, the Eastern and the Western. See, the West has, in a sense, implicitly questioned the Eastern worldview. Every worldview, I think, is limited. But I think the Western worldview, its limits have not been seen. And we need to go to a broader view, not necessarily back to the Eastern, though it may include some of the Eastern. But I think we need a kind of dialogue of these worldviews to go to something beyond, right?
Where do you see the limits of the Western worldview?
Well, just in the way of saying that it focuses too much on analysis and it tends to lead to fragmentation, you see. Now, what I mean by fragmentation is not just division, distinction, but because the parts in the whole are correlative concepts, you see. A part is a part only because it's part of a whole, like a machine or a watch, right? Now, a fragment is something it means break it up, you see. That's the root of the word, to smash, right? So if you smashed a watch, you would get fragments. Now, the Western view, it aims at getting the true parts of the universe, but in some ways, perhaps it gets fragments, not to some extent in physics, but much more so in fields like biology, psychology, sociology, and so on, right? Now, if you break it up falsely into fragments, then you have confused, you see. You're going to treat these as separate when they're not, and also you're going to unite what's in the fragment when it's not united, right? So it leads to confusion.
So in the West, you tend to confuse the part for the whole and vice versa?
Yeah, you get confused about the part and the whole because you take a fragment as an independent whole.
But if you take the true whole that includes everything, it would also include you and include your perception of the whole.
Yes.
So could you ever tell me your way of perceiving the whole to anyone else?
Well, we can have a dialogue and begin to exchange, you see. In other words, I can't tell you unless we're talking together. You see, we have to exchange our views on that, right? And perhaps now, and then there comes the problem that people are ready to listen to somebody else's worldview, you see, seriously, without resistance, without opposition. But I think the observer is an intrinsic part of the whole. That's what quantum mechanics is teaching us too in physics, right? That the observing instrument is just as much part of the whole, and therefore, because of the possibility of these non-local interactions in quantum mechanics, when an observation is made, the two systems are not really distinct, you see. Therefore, they participate in each other, and you cannot therefore get an unambiguous meaning to the measurement, right? The same happens between human beings. You see that if somebody tries to measure somebody else, talk to him, there's a mutual change which makes it impossible to get an unambiguous attribution of qualities.
It's not possible to say what David Bohm would have said in another interview.
No.
Tomorrow at the same time.
No, because we're participating together, so what I am is affected by what you're doing and what you are, and vice versa, right? That's exactly the sort of thing that happens in quantum mechanical observations.
Okay, if I say then that when I think about the whole and the part, I end up understanding that if you understand the whole, you're not able to tell it to anyone else because then you step out of the whole and become a part.
Well, I think there's a kind of communication. See, this is the point about having a different worldview. There is a kind of communication that does not begin by denying wholeness, you see. You see, if we say, here am I and here are you, and then we have already divided it, right? But perhaps we could communicate in the spirit of the whole without assuming that division, right? See, we're not trying to tell, that means I'm not trying to tell you what I think, you not trying to tell me, but rather together we are trying to discover how we're going to think together.